Last week, I had Jonathan Neville, a Book of Mormon scholar, who supports a geography of the events of the Book of Mormon taking place in the eastern United States, what is known as the Heartlander model. We also talked in a part 2 of this series about the translation of the Book of Mormon. Many of those that do believe in the Heartland model of the eastern United States for the Book of Mormon Geography also, interestingly, also believe that the Urim and Thummim was used as the instrument alone, right? Just the Urim and Thummim was used, the breastplate and the stones that were given to Joseph Smith by Moroni to translate the Book of Mormon. Those two things are the two flashpoints that we see from what the Heartlanders, air quotes here, bring in as their view of events of the Book of Mormon and the translation. In this episode, I have invited Brant Gardner, a Book of Mormon scholar who I've followed for many years, read a number of his works, and he supports a Mesoamerican model of the geography of the Book of Mormon, which is really in line with what most, we'll call it mainstream academia, would support for the geography of the events of the Book of Mormon. Additionally, in a part 2, we talk also about the translation of the Book of Mormon and why he and many of those scholars that support the Mesoamerican model also believe that Joseph Smith used the seer stone as a part of, and in fact for the majority of the translation process of the Book of Mormon. So we had one side last week. Here is the other side this week with these 2 episodes. Before we delve into this episode is brought to you by Cardio Miracle. This is a supplement that I take every single day. It is a nitric oxide supplement that has helped me in a number of different ways. You can go to cwicmedia.com, cwicmedia.com. Scroll down to the bottom there. You can watch that short video on the ways that this has helped me, and it explains why I take the supplement every day. Here's Brant Gardner. All right, welcome to Cwic Show. My name is Greg Mattson, and I am your host. In this episode, we have got Book of Mormon scholar Brant Gardner, who is going to give us a different point of view from a recent interview we just had with Jonathan Neville on Book of Mormon Geography and the translation of the Book of Mormon. Welcome to the show, Brant.
Thanks for having me.
Really appreciate you coming on. I've followed you for a number of years. I've read a lot of your material in the past. I would consider you one of the top Book of Mormon scholars, so I'm very intrigued on listening to what you have to say on this. So,
well, live up to expectations, I hope.
There we go. So, I had this interview with Jonathan Neville last year, who is a Heartlander, right? He believes in the geography of the actual events of the Book of Mormon taking place in the eastern United States. Just starting this off, why is that in error in your mind?
Well, let's start off with the good points that they have, okay?
Okay.
The good point is it fits well with tradition. So it's a very comfortable position because it says that the Hill Cumorah is exactly where we've always thought the Hill Cumorah was. And we really would like, selfishly, to have the Book of Mormon be ours and be in a place where, frankly, we white people have been. So I think those are the strengths that it has. I think everything goes downhill from there. What I have a sort of a standard policy of how I look at other geographies and any geography to try and test them out, because you really have to give everybody some opportunity, some credit. And so the first thing you want to do is at least give them a chance to be right. But there's some things that you have to do. So I look at it first with the idea of geography. What do you have to have? And everybody knows you have to have seas. You have to have a narrow neck of land. But beyond that, there's other complications in the text of things you have to have. And so things that I look for are what they do with North and South Sea. And I look at that because if you look at the text of the Book of Mormon, it's absolutely certain that there's an East and a West Sea because things happen on the East and the West Sea. nothing ever happens on the North Sea and the South Sea. And the only time you ever see the North Sea or the South Sea is in the context of where the sentence is talking about the whole world. And in the ancient world, there's a concept that we're surrounded by water, particularly in the Americas. You'll find that. So I don't see that as anything but kind of a generic, this is everywhere kind of thing. So if people are really making a big deal out of the North Sea and the South Sea, I think they're making stuff up. I really look at the locations of Manti and Bountiful. Manti and Bountiful are specifically stated to be defensive places geographically. Bountiful is controlling what appears to be the main way that anybody from the land of Nephi would go to the land of Zarahemla and vice versa. And Manti is put there to guard that. If you have a geography that puts Manti in the middle of a plain somewhere, it doesn't guard anything. You can easily go around it. So you have to have a logic there, a military purpose for Manti. Similarly with Bountiful, Bountiful guards the land northward. And if the land, that land northward, if you're too broad, it doesn't work. There is a Mesoamerican geography that suggests the Peten. And one of the things that at least one of the authors did with that is they said you have to have two Bountifuls to make this work. You've got to have one that's in the north and defensive, and you got to have one by a narrow neck. And any geography that has to make up a new place that isn't in the Book of Mormon is suspicious. So now taking that to the next level, geologically, you have to have something that accounts for 3 Nephi. And then when you get all of that together, now you've got to look at the human population. And the Book of Mormon talks about big populations. You cannot have a large population without full-scale agriculture. If you don't have large-scale agriculture, you don't have the caloric count to support people. The reason you get the first cities in the ancient Old World, Babylon, Egypt on the Nile, the reason you get these places is because they have full-scale, large-scale agriculture that supports the people. Then you get things in the Book of Mormon like kings. Well, anthropologically, we know that you have to have a certain size population before you end up with anybody that looks like a king. So the Book of Mormon requires large populations, all kinds of military movements, and requires some location where you have large-scale agriculture. So I take those things and I look at what you get out of the Heartland. And there's a couple of problems with it. One, you have to do some real interesting linguistic work to take the headwaters of the Sidon and make it a confluence of rivers rather than what normally you consider a headwater, which is where the waters begin. So that's how the Heartlanders get a south-flowing river instead of the north-flowing river. The text of the Book of Mormon says that the land of Nephi is higher than the land of Zarahemla. If you've got a river that's going between those two areas, fluid dynamics tells you it has to go downhill, which means it has to go north. So the text says you need a north-flowing river. Mississippi doesn't fit that. The text says that you have to have so many days travel. That whole eastern seaboard arrangement doesn't come close to fitting the day's travel unless you do as Neville does, which is talk about riverine travel. He says, if you go on the river. There's an article that I suspect will be published within the next year that Brian Hales has done. And fascinating article where he looked at river travel. And it's absolutely true that it is faster to go downstream than it is to walk. But it's faster to walk upstream than it is to get a boat upstream in most of those rivers. So Neville's proposal works only if they're only going one direction. If they ever go the other direction, it doesn't work. The the Hill Cumorah problem, the narrow neck of land.
Let's hold off on the Hill Cumorah.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I'll get back to that in a second. But
you see what happens when I get rolling.
So I do want to cover that for sure. But so you're going directly into geography here and talking about issues. You talk about anthropological issues and other things that might be a problem. Start off also for me here, and we'll dive into a few of these things and tell you're steel manning the Mesoamerican model, straw man the Mesoamerican model for me. What are the weaknesses
of the Mesoamerican model?
Yes.
Frankly, that's a hard one for me because I'm down to very few of them realistically. So I'll give you the ones that are theoretically the problems. The one that no matter what we do with Mesoamerica, we do not have current evidence of metallurgy at the right time. Now, that's true of any model that's north of Panama. So no matter where you put the Book of Mormon north of Panama, you don't have metallurgy at the right time period.
We do have copper in the north, right?
Having a metal is different from metallurgy. Metallurgy is you're heating it up and you're combining it with other things. Being metal, that's all over. So
okay,
yeah,
I thought there was metallurgy in copper. I thought I've read that separately, but
yeah, I mean copper. Yeah, but you heat up copper and then you have to make it into something. That hasn't happened in archaeological locations. For instance, the Hopewell, you've got pounded copper, but you don't have heated, formed, shaped copper.
Okay.
So it's still different from metallurgy. And although I will say that in some of Wayne May's presentations, he will show swords and other kinds of things, none of which any archaeologist would accept as ancient artifacts. Frankly, there's several of them that I look at and just visually I can tell you they're fakes. He's not as careful as I wish he would be.
Okay.
But again, back to Mesoamerica, metallurgy is one of them. The other, I think, that creates problems for a lot of people is trying to understand its orientation with the cardinal points of the compass. I think that's a big weakness.
And is the way to get around that, is that based more off of sunset and sunrise and times and equinox and solstice and everything else where you can kind of turn things about 23 degrees?
Well, the whole idea that you turn things comes from Sorensen, and I think that was a particularly bad decision on his part to use that terminology. And that may be the way he thought of it, but I don't think that's the way it worked.
Okay.
I think we have a different definition of north. Again, to give the defense of it, I think that's the weak point in Mesoamerica. To tell you why that doesn't bother me, we have all kinds of vehicles these days that have compasses in them. So we're, pretty familiar with the fact that you can be on a road that winds all over the place. And sometimes you think you're heading north to a city and you're actually heading northeast or you're heading northwest. But if you looked at a big map, it's all north. It's just the smaller parts are moving, which means that no matter what you're doing, you have a range that is north. And we think of north because of the compass rose as just cardinal points. And we assume that because that's what we think of and that's what our tradition is, that's what everybody believed. The evidence, at least out of Mesoamerica, is that's not the way they conceived of directions. Their direction was based on east-west, not north-south. And that's, obviously sunrise, sunset. But even north and south, the words for north and south are on the right hand or on the left hand. So the mental primary designation is east-west, where the sun goes, and north is on your right hand, or compared to where the sun is. And the sun, of course, changes through time. So what you get is an axis that's kind of like that. And north is that quadrant, anywhere in the quadrant. And again, from real travel, you don't almost never travel true north. You travel a little this way in northeast, and you travel a little. So we're used to the fact that it's a range, but we just don't see it that way because of the compass. And the way we use our maps. But
Okay.
the ancient world didn't have that kind of map, didn't have that kind of conception.
Okay, so there see some weaknesses there in the Mesoamerican model also.
Yeah,
Back to Cumorah then.
sure.
Here's the thing that I have an issue, and I'm completely neutral on this. I have no dog in the race anywhere here. It's interesting to me when I was in my 20s. I remember really going into this kind of stuff. It was kind of like candy to me, and studying it for a few years. But so the plates are in New York, Brant. The plates are in. That's the one thing we know.
Oh yeah,
For sure. The plates
Absolutely.
are in New York. So
yeah,
why are the plates in New York?
because Joseph was in New York. That's simple. You got to assume that God knew where Joseph was going to be, and so the plates have to be where Joseph is. And Joseph, you might say that they're not in Vermont because the Lord knew that the family was going to move from Vermont to New York. But it cannot be a coincidence that the prophet that's going to get the plates is somewhere near where the plates are. That's hardly shocking. The question is, of course, how did they get there and why? The question, going back to issues of geography, is the Hill Cumorah in which the plates were deposited? Well, you have to say the plates were deposited because that's where they were taken out of. It's the question of whether or not the Hill Cumorah in New York is the place where the final battle took place. That's the real issue. Because there is no issue of where the plates came from. Now, the question of when does it get named Cumorah? Of course, nobody named it Cumorah before the Book of Mormon came around. The scholars, the historians who've looked at Joseph Smith using terminology, he doesn't start using that until I think 1838 is the time we first get Joseph Smith recorded as saying it was, the Hill Cumorah.
But why is he calling it the Hill Cumorah?
Well, because everybody else is. Oliver Cowdery was early doing that. So Joseph picked up on the vocabulary. It's the same thing we'll talk about with the Urim and Thummim. That's a late vocabulary. Joseph didn't use it for a long time and then eventually did. He picked up the language that everybody else was using. He's no different than the rest of us. He's lived in a community, and when the community starts using a certain term for something, he ended up using it.
So here's what I've got on here. I've got in Moroni's first visit to Joseph, he identifies the location of the plates as the Hill Cumorah.
That is actually not known. The record of that comes late.
The record of it speaking back to that period.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem.
We're saying that, and I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you were saying that Moroni doesn't say Cumorah.
At least we do not know exactly what he said because they say it later. That later designation, by the time that gets written down, everybody's saying Cumorah, and that's the way everybody knows the hill. And so that term gets put into the historical record.
Okay, I've got 3 more points here on this. Okay. In early 1827, before he obtains the plates, Joseph and his family referred to the hill by the name Cumorah. It's one. Oliver Cowdery learned the name. I hadn't
seen that record. I'd love to see the reference for that.
Plates in May 1829 in Pennsylvania. And in 1829, David Whitmer learned the name for the first time from a divine messenger who was taking the Harmony plates back to Cumorah. That's the story of maybe one of the 3 Nephites, right?
Yeah. The comment on your dating. The dates are correct for when the events occurred. It is not correct for when they were recorded as having occurred. So they were not recorded on those dates. They're not contemporaneous. All of the accounts are coming much later and talking about what happened earlier.
So
therefore, the later vocabulary is moved back.
So you had mentioned before, you did say the Hill Cumorah where the plates were placed. Is everything then about the name of Cumorah in New York simply based on basically a nickname?
Yeah. Now, here's the thing that I've never seen anybody who talks about the New York Cumorah deal with, other than, again, trying to find some excuse for it. We have exactly one piece of information about plates that were buried in the Hill Cumorah. So there were plates buried in the Hill Cumorah. Mormon says, and it's Mormon 6:6. And he said, and I buried all of the plates in the Hill Cumorah, except the ones I gave Moroni. Okay, which sets of plates did Joseph Smith get? The ones that, according to the Book of Mormon, were not in Hill Cumorah.
Well, there's certain accounts saying that they were given to him at different times. I mean, you had the plates of Mormon at first, and then maybe the small plates later.
No matter how you read that one, you have to go back to what Mormon says, which is, I took the records and I put everything in the hill except what I gave to Moroni. Now, in order to get around that, you're going to have Moroni go back to the Hill Cumorah and put plates there and never mention it, which you could have done, but there's no mention. We don't know that. Or you have to have, in this multiple plate scenario, somebody going back to the Hill Cumorah and taking out plates that Moroni never had. And, all of those things are real interesting workarounds, but there's absolutely no evidence for it. And the only reason for coming up with those hypotheses is to get around the fact that the Book of Mormon says that the plates that Joseph Smith received were not in the Hill Cumorah. So,
okay.
They were in a hill. They were in a hill in New York. It just wasn't the Hill Cumorah.
Okay, so just a couple points then for clarification here. So, based on what you're saying, there is no, I don't know the right word for this, but there is no early recorded name of Cumorah given to the hill in New York. When I say early, I mean late 20s, early 30s. Right.
Yeah. It comes after 1830 that you're finally getting that.
Speaking back to the late 20s, early 30s, and when these events happened.
Right. And if you think about it, the history isn't being recorded until after that. You don't get the first history of Joseph Smith until 1832, right? The one that he's writing is his early one. So the whole idea that you even want to write down the history, that isn't even important until after the Book of Mormon is published and somebody believes it. And then, people are joining the church and they want to know the history. And so you tell them the history. But it was not written down contemporaneously, which means that we're getting the dates when things happen, but the vocabulary that's being used to explain it is taking the language that they've learned and applying it backwards.
Projecting back on what they had.
Which is what
then we would be doing in talking about the Hill Cumorah pageant.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. The 1842 Wentworth letter. Joseph had replaced Orson Pratt's hemispheric speculation with the declaration that Lehi's remnant were the Indians that now inhabit this country.
I'm not sure it says country. I think it's continent.
Continent. Okay.
Yeah, and a big important difference between continent and country. Continent at the time, if you look at the way they were using it, it was the entire hemisphere. When they said this continent, they didn't limit it. It was not limited to North America, South America. It was basically Western Hemisphere, and certainly larger than country.
Okay. Here's another one. How about Doctrine and Covenants 128:20? And again, what do we hear? Glad tidings from Cumorah.
Sure. When is it
what are the glad
down?
tidings? If the Book of Mormon is from Cumorah, how do we explain this?
Well, that goes, I guess, to try to understand the nature of language in Revelation. Do you assume that when the Revelation uses a word, it uses the precise word that you're thinking it uses? And if you do, you don't know anything about how the Doctrine and Covenants came about and how the revelations were recorded. They've been edited and changed multiple times. Several times there are things that were in the original that kind of got edited out. So, for instance, when they're talking, and this goes back to translation stuff, but it was, and I can't remember how it got changed, but anyway, there was in the early one with Oliver Cowdery, they were talking about his talent with the sprout, and that gets changed, I think, to maybe rod or something. Anyway, whatever it is, there was some backwards editing to clean up language so that it was more acceptable and more understandable. So that whole process of taking modern language and pushing it back, that's how we get Cumorah in there. That's how Urim and Thummim gets all over the Doctrine and Covenants. Is they intentionally push these language things. This is the way we're calling it, and so it gets pushed into the edited version of the Doctrine and Covenants. So to try and use that to say this is exactly the Cumorah, that says way more than the Doctrine and Covenants intended to say. And one of the reasons I would say that, because that almost sounds like I'm saying prophets aren't prophets, and that's not true. And one of the things that the Heartlanders will say for we poor Mesoamerican people is that we don't, believe the prophets. Of course we do. We just happen to believe all of them, including the current ones who said we don't know. We have no idea where the geography is. And if Joseph Smith had a very firm idea of geography and he was absolutely right, how did that get lost so fast? How was it that every single prophet after Joseph forgot what Joseph said?
Okay. Maybe we'll get back to that. I wanted to go a couple more points, then I want to go back to the Mesoamerican model. So this is from the Joseph Smith papers, 1823. Moroni says to Joseph Smith, quote, "The record is on a side hill on the Hill Cumorah, 3 miles from this place. Remove the grass and moss, and you will find a large flat stone. Pry that up, and you will find the record under it, laying on 4 pillars of cement. Then the angel left him." Now, this is from Joseph Smith history, 1844 to 1845. So again, to your point, he's projecting back. But again, he's putting the word Cumorah in Angel Moroni's mouth.
Yeah, of course. Not a surprise at all. Yeah, I mean, by that time, that's how everybody knew the hill. It was a popular idea. I mean, the idea that people think that the Hill Cumorah was in New York, that started very early and probably with Oliver. And everybody who knew Oliver and everybody who talked about it started calling it that. That's the way it became known. In the local community, it was not known as Cumorah. It was known as Mormon Hill. So it was only the Mormons that called it Cumorah, even after the Mormons named it that. The locals said it was Mormon Hill because they knew there was a connection there. But, it's an applied name. It was a name that again, frankly, from a misreading of the Book of Mormon, how else are you going to tell, what the Hill Cumorah is? Where do you learn about Cumorah? Well, only from the Book of Mormon. Now, Moroni could have said something, certainly, but there really wasn't any reason for Moroni to say anything other than, by the way, the plates are in this hill. And then the real question, of course, and no matter how you argue the vocabulary, the real question is, does the New York Hill fit anything that we see in the Book of Mormon? Does it fit in that context? Regardless of what anybody said about it, does the Book of Mormon itself allow that hill? Does anything fit? And the answer is no. Nothing fits. The geography is off. The location to the rest of the known locations of things are off. The location of the narrow neck of land. If I remember correctly, most of the things that are based near the Great Lakes try to put the narrow neck of land between Lake Superior and Erie, somewhere near Buffalo. Yeah. There's a nice narrow neck of land heading up into Canada. And that's a good neck of land. But the Cumorah has to be north of that. And this one's southeast. You can't have Hill Cumorah southeast of the narrow neck of land. It doesn't work. The entire Book of Mormon depends on the fact that the Hill Cumorah is in the land northward.
Is there only one narrow neck of land?
Adamant about making that point. Pardon?
Is there only one narrow neck of land?
There's a narrow passage and a narrow neck, and there's nothing in the text that I can think of that would suggest that there's more than one narrow neck. They're pretty consistent about it, and it's a gateway between what they call the land southward and the land northward. And Mormon is absolutely adamant that the land northward is connected to Jaredites and destruction, and that's why Moroni says that the Hill Ramah and the Hill Cumorah are exactly the same. Frankly, I doubt that they were, but symbolically they're the same because you had both peoples die on the hill.
Okay,
and so
let me
the same hill.
Because that I haven't heard before either. So you're saying that possibly the Hill Ramah and the Hill Cumorah are not the same hill in the Book of Mormon?
The Book of Mormon says they are. Moroni says they are. And I may be one of the only people who says probably not, because it was a good literary trope for Mormon to say that, or for Moroni to say that. There's a good literary reason for it. But if you think about it and you're trying to say, okay, here's Moroni who's trying to describe the extinction of a people that happened some 600 years before, and he's got the record of Ether, how in the world does he know which hill it was? If you've got 5 hills, how do you know which one? Well, is there anything in the Book of Ether that says, by the way, there was this particular formation, and because you could see this rock, you knew which hill it? It's entirely possible that there was direct revelation, and if there was, then they were the same hill. But literarily, they had to be the same hill, whether they were or not.
Now, so when Limhi's people go looking for Zarahemla, and they discover all the bones and the 24 plates of the Jaredites, is that Ramah?
No, I think that's a Jaredite people that are north, but I don't think that's in the same location. I mean, well, and again, this is my Mesoamerican perspective.
Sure.
And, based on where things work and how the story is told, there is a way that it works really nicely in the Mesoamerican area. That's sort of atextual information, sort of like putting another layer on that says, if you put the Book of Mormon in this area, here's how the story works out, which I think is important, but it's not one where you can say, yes, this was or wasn't. From a textual standpoint, there isn't anything that says that it was Ramah. It just says they find the bones of the Lamani or the Jaredites, and
I do have Joseph Smith here saying they're the same hill.
Pardon?
I do have Joseph Smith, though, saying it's the same place.
Yeah, that's not surprising. I mean, it's what it says in the text, so that's not surprising.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I'm the one that says it may not be because, as someone who looks at ancient histories,
mm-hmm.
I look at what those people are doing and how they're looking at the world around them, and particularly how they're formatting or creating their texts. And Moroni isn't creating a text to tell us absolute history with precision. That isn't his purpose at all. There's a greater purpose. And the reason for including the plates of ether was to justify the way Mormon used those plates in the creation of how he told the story of the Nephites. Looking at it as an ancient historian would look at it, I don't see how he would have known that other than to say he had a direct revelation, which could have been. But that would be the only way. There's nothing he would have had where he could say, yeah, I know this is the same hill because I can see that it's the same hill.
Okay. Back to the Mesoamerican model. Is there anything in the last several years, last few years, 10 years, where we've said, okay, where you could say this solidifies even more the Mesoamerican model? Any discoveries, any idea? Obviously there's not archaeological, but as you see, you bring up things like population, you bring up maybe other discoveries of geography even, or something within the text.
Well, the major thing that's happened recently is all of the LIDAR studies. And what the LIDAR has done is tell us that there's way more people than we ever thought were there. And we thought there were a lot of people.
This is the technology that looks from above and can see things below the ground.
Not below the ground, sees the surface of the ground below the canopy of the trees in the forest.
Okay.
So what it does is allows you to peer through the trees and be able to see the elevation in the ground that you would not see because everything is covered. Mm-hmm. So if you fly over some of these areas, you wouldn't see that there was a city down there because there's so much overgrowth that you can't see down. You'd have to be on the ground. And then what you see is, a mountain, but you don't know if it's natural or man-made. What this one does is allow you to see down through vegetation to get to the hard. So what LIDAR does is it sends a signal down to bounce off something hard, and it bounces off the ground or stone. And then when they do that and it bounces back, now you're seeing these squared off temples and these other buildings that nobody has seen before because they don't go to that part of the jungle and they haven't seen down through the canopy. So LIDAR is really good for seeing things you would not see. I heard that they were trying to use LIDAR to see something about Zarahemla in Illinois, and I've been to that area, and you don't need LIDAR. You can see forever. You don't need to go down through the blades of grass to see what you're looking at. So it's very different than the way LIDAR is being used. It's not ground.
What has LIDAR given us then? What have we learned from it?
We have learned that there were millions of people that were supported in the Maya territory, that it was much more complex civilization than we had thought. We have excavated, at one point in time, they were believing that we had excavated maybe 6%. And that was prior to LIDAR. And so now we're way below 1% of anything in the Maya that has been excavated, which means that our archaeological knowledge of the Maya is really, really small compared to what we might know if we had excavated more. But what we do know is that there was complex civilization. There were lots and lots of people there. There were roads communicating from city to city. It's just a really big complex. Now, going back to my idea when I was talking about population, that tells us there's a huge population. How does that compare to the Heartland? Well, Heartland villages were 1,000, maybe up to 2,000 people. They were never that large. They couldn't get any larger because although they had agriculture, it was incipient agriculture, couldn't provide the caloric count, so they still had to go out and do hunting and gathering in order to feed the people. And what that means is you can't have that many people in one place, which is why it's limited to 1,000 to 2,000. And then you've got to have separation to another place so that you've got better hunting grounds. So everything that we know about archaeology, about the agriculture, tells us that you can't have a large, sophisticated population in the Northeast. It was never there. There's no archaeological evidence, and all of the evidence is it could not have happened because you didn't have the caloric base to support it. On the other hand, you get down to the Maya territory, and it was massive. Now, why could you do that? Well, you've got corn, beans, and squash.
Would you squash? Is that what you said the third one was?
Squash, yeah, the Holy Trinity. And that actually the corn, beans, and squash makes up an entire protein. So for a people that has limited access to protein through meat, a diet that is combined with the corn, beans, and squash gives them the protein they need. So it was a great diet, and because it was a good diet, it supported a lot of people, millions of people. So yeah, archaeologically,
which you obviously could not get from just the hunting the wilderness animals like the Gadiant robbers go out and start doing.
Yeah, you can't do that. You can't have a really large population and do that. I mean, and this is all over the world. You forget Book of Mormon. This is just human populations. We know how they work because we've seen them through time all over the world, and hunter-gatherers up to 100 in a group, and then they start to split because you need the territory. Incipient farming will let you get up to 1,000 to 2,000. And you might get a chief of a village, but you'll never get a king because there aren't enough people to support a king. So political systems, everything, gets back to being dependent upon having that agricultural base. And it's one of those things that nobody ever thinks of for the Book of Mormon. Nobody says, what do I have to eat? We just don't ask that question because, particularly in the United States, we've all got more than enough to eat. The ancient world didn't. And that's the huge thing. You just the description of population, the Book of Mormon is big. You've got cities, you've got lots of governmental things going on. You have a religion that allows differentiation and hierarchy of people who operate it. You've got a chief priests. You've got to have large populations in order to be able to do those kinds of things. And again, that's based on the way the world works in other places. So everything about the Book of Mormon says, frankly, you've got to have large-scale agriculture, and you don't have it in the Northeast.
Now, with the Mesoamerican model, then is everything pretty much, focused on the Mayan?
It is because
both Lamanites and Nephites, and then maybe Jaredites still with the Olmecs. Is that still the standard idea?
Yeah, that's the standard location. And I have to get on my hobby horse here and make sure we clarify terms. I think the worst thing that happens when people look at the Mesoamerican idea is that they will say that the Jaredites were the Olmec, and that the Nephites or the Lamanites were the Maya. Actually, I could probably go along with Lamanites and Maya, but certainly not Nephites. It is sort of, the Maya today, they're called the Maya people, but if you ask one of them, how about this village over there? You're Maya, they say they're Maya, and they go, no, we're totally different. That's a totally different city. They dress different. They're not related to us at all. It was city-based at the time, and anciently it appears to be city-based. So the way I would try to say it is that the Nephites participated in Maya culture. So not that they were the Maya, there were a whole bunch of Maya that would never have known a Nephite, would never have come into contact with anybody. Now, the reason I said that the Lamanites might be Maya, the Nephite definition of a Lamanite is anybody who's not us. If they're my enemy, they're a Lamanite. I don't care where they came from. And Jacob is the one that says that. So Jacob comes up with that definition where he says, Lamanites are just somebody else.
But don't they say, even from the beginning, there's 7 tribes, 4 of them are Lamanites, and then at the end of the Book of Mormon, you have the 7 tribes still, and 4 of them are Lamanites. They still are all sourced from Lehi's Exodus. Yeah,
and they're all sourced from Nephite records. The Nephites are carrying on that tradition. I've had a couple of discussions with people about the 7 tribes because it really kind of bothered me. There are traditions in Mesoamerica of 7 tribes. And so I've seen proponents of Mesoamerica say that the 7-tribe Mesoamerican tradition matches up with the 7 tribes. And a friend of mine made the right suggestion, I think, which is it's probably the other way around. We get 7 tribes among the Nephites because that was the tradition in the area. You'll notice that Sam is kicked out of the tribal list.
Or adopted in, at least.
Well, he's adopted into somebody else's.
Yes.
But, that doesn't mean he didn't have a family. That meant, in other words, what you're getting is a manipulation of the genealogy.
Sure.
And the genealogy is being manipulated to become 7 tribes. And it's probably influenced by the people that were there and not the fact that the Nephites influenced the other people. And that's the big thing that, for me as a Mesoamericanist, I think the worst thing that we've done is pretend that Nephites caused Maya culture. That's so demonstrably wrong and frankly inconceivable that I know why people like Michael Coe didn't think much of the Book of Mormon, because the way it was presented is, well, these guys influenced everybody there and they made everybody better and bigger culture, and I can't see how that would have happened realistically. And if you look at the Book of Mormon, there is a time when you have Nephites, Ammon and his brethren are going back to teach the people in the land of Nephi, and they convert the anti-Nephi Lehites. That's the whole story. But the important part of that is they leave Zarahemla. They go back to the land of Nephi. And they start talking about cultural things that are happening there. And they talk about the king over this land and the king over that land, and then the king over the kings. Mm-hmm. There's a top king, which, by the way, is quite Maya. We've seen, we have Maya records that talk about these organizations where there was a ruler in each of the cities, and then there's somebody on top of them. There's information about state visits. And if you read between the lines, they're going to a much higher culture than what they're coming from in Zarahemla. So as much as the Nephites stereotype the Lamanites as being inferior and living in tents and being wild, etc., and that stereotype lasts a long time, when you actually see them up close, they seem to have a higher culture than the Nephites do. Now, based on the geography that I prefer, which is the one that Sorensen came up with, I think that geography works the best. Based on that geography, it's actually true. It's actually true that all of the really big, fantastic, wonderful stuff is happening in Lamanite territory. And it's not as cool when you get down into Zarahemla land. And I think if you, again, read between the lines of the text, it supports that. Okay. It doesn't support the way we think of it. Yeah. Mormons are infamous for saying any pretty ruin is Nephite and an ugly ruin is Lamanite. So listen to any tour guide.
So I want to move to I want to move to translation here. Is there anything else you wanted to put in on the geography side?
No, we could probably go another hour or so on that, and we'll move on.
Okay. All right. So I want to move to translation then.